Monster Hunter Generations is a multiplayer online action RPG released in 2016 for the Nintendo 3DS. You create a customized character who takes on jobs as a monster hunter, surprise, in a fantasy-light, primevally textured world. And I'm going to approach this review a little differently from other games because the Monster Hunter franchise is kind of unique among game series for a few reasons. We'll come back to the setting in a second. Each game in the series isn't really all that different from previous installments. So they each nominally have a light narrative that kind of pushes you to hunt more and more monsters, but it's in no way a major focus of the game, and it's not really a story in the way, Final Fantasy has stories. And unlike a lot of other game series with Monster Hunter, you're not really missing out on much if you only choose to play the most recent installment in the franchise. Many of the classic maps and monsters carry over from game to game with graphical, mechanical, and quality of life improvements. And if you go back to some of the older games, there are some monsters that haven't made it to the most recent installment, so that might be why you'd want to go back and play older games in the franchise to see some of the monsters that you're missing in the latest game. But other than that, you're probably best off playing the most recent game, because that's what, especially if you're playing it online, that's what most people will be playing. And you got to compare that to something like I said earlier, Final Fantasy, where Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy X are two fundamentally different games with different significant plot and mechanics. I hadn't played the Monster Hunter series at all before I started streaming. I got started with Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate for You, which I played briefly before transitioning to Generations, which came out while I was streaming. And I would consider this review my commentary on Monster Hunter as a franchise as of 2016. We might do another one of these for the next installment. Not so much a specific critique of Generations. I'll be trying to loop in some ways that Generations improved on For You. Anyway, though, Monster Hunter is probably best described as a series of long-form boss encounters against a huge cast of giant monsters, and it's probably easiest to explain the setting in the context of a typical 2-hour session. So typically, you'll spend your 2-hour session hunting several big monsters, more or fewer depending on your build and whether you're playing in single-player or multiplayer. Multiplayer groups tend to hunt much faster. You spend some time in a lobby area collecting MMO-like quests from NPCs, preparing for the hunt by eating food and buying items. Then you select the monster you want to hunt and head out to one of several huge multi-zone maps. On each map, you're tasked with first finding the monster by scouting through the different zones. When you encounter your prey, you'll spend several minutes dodging its attacks, whittling down its health before the monster inevitably flees to a different zone. This isn't just something that monsters do occasionally. Every single monster is going to run away from you eventually, and you're going to have to keep hunting it down on the map. It's a fundamental feature of the game. You'll chase them down until you finally deplete their health and complete the mission. Successfully defeating monsters rewards the players with monster parts, which can be used to craft gear that improve your character's vital statistics. And that's the only way you progress statistically in Monster Hunter. You don't gain experience points, like in a typical RPG. Your gear gets better as you fight more and more monsters. There's sort of a main story quest chain that unlocks more monsters and content. Completing those main scenario missions pushes you toward the end game, but doing them doesn't make your character any stronger than you were at the beginning of the game. That's all gear. The style of combat in this game is intense and very challenging. It rewards precise and careful inputs and really punishes button mashing. In a way, it's kind of similar to Dark Souls' combat, in that all of your actions drain a stamina meter, you have to carefully manage it. You commit to almost all attack animations. It's rare to be able to animation cancel. Once you press the button, your character's going to do what you told them to do. And you're expected to avoid damage by rolling or otherwise getting out of the way of telegraphed attacks. But that's really just the bullet points of the game. If you look at the bullet points describing Monster Hunter, you would say, wow, that sounds like Dark Souls. But it doesn't really feel like a Souls game, and that's kind of difficult to describe. Part of it is that a major feature of the series is its very intentional lack of UI feedback to the player. So unlike Souls and a lot of other action RPGs, the game doesn't have floating damage numbers when you're attacking monsters or taking damage from monsters, and it doesn't have a monster health bar. So you're kind of expected to intuit your efficacy through subtle changes in character and monster animations. Weak attacks will bounce harmlessly off of monsters in certain parts of their body, and the monster will start to limp when it gets weakened, that sort of thing. It's a really cool idea, and it's really unusual to have a franchise focus on it so heavily. This idea of we're not going to show you the monster health bar, we're not going to show you floating damage numbers has survived many installments in the franchise, and I think that fans of this series really appreciate that about Monster Hunter. It's something that stands out from other games. On the difficulty side, though, it does start to approach the difficulty of Souls games. A single mistake can be very punishing indeed as you get to the later monsters in the endgame. Now, as far as Cathartic Milestones, what are the events that happen in the game that will make you feel accomplished for having played during your session? There's really only one Cathartic Milestone in Monster Hunter, and it's a big one, hunting monsters. A single monster hunt can take anywhere from 5 to 45 minutes to complete, depending on if you're doing it single player, what build you're using, if you're familiar with the monster's animations. And there's basically no consolation prize for failing a hunt. So the one thing that's going to make you feel accomplished for playing is beating up the monsters and winning. There are some other light activities you can do, like farming for materials, fishing, mining, but these activities are all pretty shallow in the context of monster hunting. And I don't think that you would turn on this game and, go mining for 2 hours and feel like you really played Monster Hunter. All those things are just there to bolster the experience of the monster hunt. So that brings me to the audience side of the equation. Who should play Monster Hunter? I'd say that this series is for hardcore gamers, not for casual or non-gamers. It definitely requires that you not only be intimately familiar and literate with a controller. Since most of these games are for handheld platforms, you actually have to develop a sort of claw with your hands to be able to control the game effectively. And being in a position where you're willing to make yourself physically uncomfortable to play the game because you like it that much, that's the sort of audience that Monster Hunter is reaching out to. I'd also say that Monster Hunter is more fun when you're playing it multiplayer with other people as opposed to doing it single player. You can technically play the whole game single player. You'll have a much harder time in the process. But unlike a game like Dark Souls, where the entire game is balanced around single-player fights and playing it multiplayer trivialize a lot of the combat, I think it's kind of the other way around for Monster Hunter, where if you're doing a hunt completely single-player, it's going to be a lot harder and in a less interesting way, since it's sort of assuming that you've got other people helping you out, distracting the monster temporarily so you can get some damage in. Into the subsets of audience, achievement gamers, people that want to get all the things, they want to beat the game, they want to collect everything. I think that Monster Hunter is the achievement gamer's game. Like, if you're looking for something to fill your time that you want to spend each day fighting another monster and getting further and upgrading your gear more, this is the game for you. It's very challenging to 100%, if we call 100% getting to the maximum rank, defeating every monster, collecting every monster armor part, leveling up every different weapon style. So I think that if you want to have a game that this is the only game you play, then this is a really good one to pick. If you're looking to just kind of beat it, it's kind of difficult to decide what is beating Monster Hunter. When I played it on stream, I called beating the game seeing each unique monster and defeating them once as part of a group. But you can keep playing this game indefinitely. Like, there's different ways to scale up the monsters to make them nastier. You have different challenges from playing them with different weapon styles. So yeah, I think that this is absolutely a game for achievement gamers. It might even be the flagship game for achievement gamers. Exploration gamers, not as much in this game, in that there's a very small number of maps that you can explore, and each of the maps has a limited number of subzones. They're reused for every monster fight, and within 10 or so hours of gameplay, you'll have mastered these maps pretty closely. You'll have a sense of where monsters are going to run to, depending on whether they fly or run around, that sort of thing. So I don't really think we're going to talk about exploration from a map perspective. Exploration in this game I would define as seeing the next monster, seeing their design, how they behave, what their mechanics are, what their flavor is, which we'll talk about shortly. And that is very exciting because since this game is basically a series of boss fights, there's not a lot of time spent exploring the map or fighting non-boss monsters. It's pretty much boss after boss after boss, almost like Shadow of the Colossus. They've managed to put a lot of care and effort and time into developing the monsters that are in these games. So they all feel very unique and different from each other. And I think that seeing what's around the next corner, what the next monster is going to be and how it's going to behave, even partway through the fight, is what an exploration gamer is going to get out of this. Flavor in this case, like I said earlier, this game is pretty light on story. Each game in the franchise does nominally have a story that pushes you to see some of the flagship monsters that are included in that entry in the franchise, but I don't think that, if you skipped all the cutscenes and didn't read a single line of dialogue, you would really miss anything. Basically, there are monsters, we have to hunt them, right? So you wouldn't come to Monster Hunter for the flavor of a traditional video game narrative. Instead, the flavor in this game is presented in the monster behaviors. So just to give a couple examples without spoiling anything, there's a blind monster in this game, and because it's blind, it changes a lot about the fight. There's no music that plays during the fight, which is very unusual. It's immune to effects that work on enemies that have sight, and there's a lot of other cool little monster mechanics like that in this game actually act as flavor. It's paying attention, playing the game with other people, and sharing with other people. Hey, did you notice that when you fight this monster, it does this thing at this time if you use this ability? I think that's really the draw from the flavor perspective, is how have they made these monsters feel unique and real, more so than the appeal of like a cohesive story. It wouldn't really draw you into this series, I think. Monster Hunter is a little unique too, and we're going to have like a bridge section where I'm talking both about flavor and mechanics at the same time, because this franchise makes a point of deploying and maintaining mechanics specifically to support its flavor, even if those mechanics are unusual in the rest of the modern gaming world. So I already talked a little bit earlier about the fact that monsters don't have visible health bars, that you don't have floating damage numbers for your weapons. These are all very flavorful things, and I think that the core idea here is that Monster Hunter has a fantasy or a dream that it's trying to achieve. You're trying to play out this fantasy of a kind of primeval, almost, prehistoric world where you need to fight and hunt these monsters to survive. So you need to eat food, you need to keep your weapons sharp, you need to forage for berries. You need to take care of yourself on the path to hunting a monster. And there's all these mechanics that are in the game that are built around keeping this flavor dream alive. I think that as the series has evolved and people have focused more and more on the video game, let's kill the monsters side of it, those mechanics keep falling more and more by the wayside as they get affected by quality of life improvements. We see this a lot in MMOs where something like a teleportation feature in an MMO is a great quality of life feature, but it makes the world feel small and segmented when you're not having to walk through it all the time. Similarly, I think a lot of these ideas of you need to eat food, you need to sharpen your weapon, kind of just become inconveniences over time instead of actually reinforcing the flavor. But I think if you're coming into Monster Hunter for the first time, you can have that experience of what Capcom wants you to feel here, that, I have to take care of myself, and I have to survive, and I have to hunt this thing down and chase it from map to map. It doesn't start to wear on you until after you've fought your 100th monster, and you're like, okay, can I just get to the part of the game? Can I get to the meat of the game that I want to play? So it's a really cool idea, and I'm hopeful that if the Monster Hunter series continues to focus on this flavor presentation, that they can find a way to balance quality of life improvements while keeping the flavor interesting. So into mechanics proper from there, disconnected from the flavor of the series. I think that, like I said earlier, if this is the flagship franchise for an achievement gamer, it's also the flagship franchise for a mechanics gamer. There are so many well-balanced and well-tuned mechanics in Monster Hunter, and the really cool thing is that while it doesn't have traditional RPG classes, each weapon is a 100% different playstyle from every other weapon. So what weapon you choose to play will absolutely change your playstyle and your approach to fighting every single monster, and there's so much cool design space in each of the different weapons for whether you're fighting very quickly, whether you're trying to build up a single charged attack. That's also true of a game like Dark Souls, but I think it takes it to the nth degree. There's so much more love and care spent on the weapon design in Monster Hunter because it's such a definitive feature of your playstyle. So yeah, I think that if you're a mechanics gamer, that you should absolutely check out the Monster Hunter series, because it's really cool just to explore the design space of monster encounters, ways you have to deal with certain monsters. There are, consumable items that are useless most of the time, but against a single monster, if you use it at just the right moment, will make the fight a lot more simple to approach. Generations in particular adds a lot in this area with hunter arts that you can equip that customize the sorts of actions you can take that combo pretty well with the weapons that you select, so you can make an even more specific build. And even adds a Babby's First Monster Hunter mode where you can play as one of the cat characters, Palico, which I did for most of my playthrough, simply because the game has so many mechanics that it's really intimidating to a new player, especially a person who's trying to play it in multiplayer. that removing a lot of the complexity of the game let me do it, just see the meat of it and appreciate it a little bit more. And we'll talk about some of that complexity a bit later in the opportunities section, because while I mentioned in flavor that I like this idea of let's chase down the monsters and hunt them, I think that the game is becoming increasingly arcadey and video gamey and focused more and more on the actual boss fight. I think for a lot of those flavorful mechanics that Capcom is kind of at a crossroads here with this franchise. They either need to decide whether Monster Hunter is this arcadey, difficult multiplayer boss fight game, or if they want to double down more and more on the flavor side of it and make it more about the survival and the hunt. Because it seems like the survival hunt side of Monster Hunter is dying more and more as it's affected by quality of life improvements. So either they just need to go entirely, or the game needs to be made more about that. Or they need to split it into two separate series. You know, whatever the solution is, I think that at least the Palicos edition in Generations is a really good compromise, because it lets a player like me decide, you know what, the complexity of the hunt side of it, having to sharpen my weapons, having to stay warm in cold environments, having to eat food during a mission, is less interesting to me. So I would rather just make it more arcadey and play Fisher-Price Monster Hunter by playing as a Palico. So it would be interesting if this continues to be a mainstay in the series and they continue to offer that compromise option for players like me. Regarding style and polish, it's Capcom, so the game is very stylish and very polished. It has a consistent visual approach in its UI. It's not particularly buggy. You get some wonky hitboxes for certain monsters, but at this point, those monsters have been around so long and their hitboxes have been janky for so long that it's probably intentional on the part of Capcom that they're still that way. You feel a lot of intent behind it, and the style of Monster Hunter is cool in that it's kind of doing this, like I said, primeval, prehistorical, like almost caveman approach to an aesthetic where it's not about, you know, fancy, flashy shoulder armor like you'd see in something like World of Warcraft, or, you know, asymmetrical pendants and zippers like you'd see in something like Final Fantasy. You know, you're hunting these monsters and then you're carving up their body parts and then wearing their body parts as your armor. So all of the armor looks like skins that you're equipping, and in this case, we're literally using the word skin to describe the armor that you have. So I really like this game from a style and polish perspective. It really stands out from its competitors. One thing that I think is missing here, you know, if the only way that your character can really differentiate themselves is by what gear you have equipped, it's really unfortunate that there's not some sort of transmogging system in Monster Hunter Generations or in the prior entries in the series. You know, there are certain armor sets that look really, really cool, and the fact that you can't disconnect those from the stats that are associated with them, I think, is a massive bummer. It would be really cool to try to mix and match and make a custom hunter style, especially when you're playing it online and people can see what different transmogs you come up with. But I'm hopeful that seems like a simple enough thing that they could add into the series in the future. I don't think that is at odds with the, you know, flavor focus that Capcom has on the series. So I could see transmogging getting added in the future. I'll also add here that this game is much sillier than I thought it was going to be coming into it. I had no idea what Monster Hunter was like. I just knew that there were monsters and that you hunt them. So when I booted it up and saw the little goofy bipedal cats walking around with spears, it kind of took me by surprise. But the game, it plays it well, you know, and I think that that's appropriate with how arcadey the series has become. It's kind of neat to poke fun at what Monster Hunter is all about. You have these giant, very serious-looking monsters most of the time, but the environment that leads up to fighting them is pretty whimsical, and I think that's the right approach. It's the right style for this game. I don't think it would work if it was grimdark and serious like Dark Souls is. And finally, hype. Is Monster Hunter a hype-filled game? I think we can pretty conclusively say yes to that question. Along with Dragon Quest, this game is really important in Japan. A new Monster Hunter game comes out and everybody loses their shit. A lot of that has to do with it being on portable consoles, so people can play it on their commutes and bring it with them wherever they go. The Japanese love Monster Hunter, and although it's a smaller community, there's a group of people who love Monster Hunter in the West and are really, really into it. I think the fact that there's such a multiplayer focus definitely plays into that. You want to get online, you want to watch somebody who's playing it on Twitch, you want to ask if you can join them in their hunt, you want to critique their approach to fighting, what weapon styles they're using. I think this is the sort of game that you want to get around the water cooler and talk to somebody else about the monsters, how you approach fighting them, how long you struggled with one monster versus another, whether you got the new gear set that you've been working toward. So yeah, if hype draws you to games, if you want to get on Twitch or get on YouTube and watch somebody else play it, I think it's rewarding to watch someone play through Monster Hunter, especially when they're blind, because like I mentioned earlier, the flavor of Monster Hunter is most impactful before the game becomes arcadey to you, before you are fighting, the same monster for the 100th time. You want to see that blind playthrough when it's still new to them and they're surprised by something that a monster does instead of annoyed by it. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of value in the hype category for this game. Moving then into the strengths and opportunities sections. I'm actually not going to have a spoiler divider in this video because there aren't really spoilers in Monster Hunter. To me, a spoiler for this game is watching somebody complete an entire hunt against a monster you've never seen before, and now you know how that monster behaves. I think that's the fun of this game, is seeing how the monsters behave for the first time. So I might refer to a couple specific monsters and maybe a couple attacks, but I don't think it's anything that really warrants a spoiler threshold. So instead, we're just going to talk about strengths, opportunities, and then final thoughts. So you got to ask the question then, is Monster Hunter as a franchise important? And I would say absolutely yes. Generations in particular only has kind of mild improvements, I think, to the franchise, although the ability to play as a Palico, I at least personally, as someone who hasn't played the franchise for a long time, I see that as being a pretty big deal. But there are other companies that are making Monster Hunter-like games. Monster Hunter inspires the way we treat boss fights in video games, especially in multiplayer co-op games. So I would say absolutely that Monster Hunter is important. I think Monster Hunter is at its strongest when you're fighting the monsters, I know. But particularly it's at its strongest when you're fighting the later monsters and the monsters that have been designed in the more recent entries in the franchise, when Capcom has had time to learn and iterate on their design. I think that most of the later monsters have really good mechanics and tells to let you know when you should be responding to attacks. They often have good conveyance so that you can figure out what you're supposed to do on a sight read without having to look up a walkthrough or read a tutorial. So I think that the monster design is great, and really that's what draws people to these titles. I think the multiplayer experience is a huge draw for people too, since the monster fights take so long and are generally fairly challenging, especially in the upper echelons when you are punished more heavily for making mistakes. Winning feels really satisfying. It's very cathartic when 4 of you come together and win, since this is a game where the failure of one individual player can bring everybody else down if one person is particularly bad. So I think that this is, if you're interested in a good co-op experience that you can play in sort of bite-sized chunks. I guess the bites can be fairly large. If you're fighting the more difficult monsters, it can run as long as 30 to 45 minutes. But it's a single scenario that you're looking to play and then put the game down. I think that Monster Hunter is a great choice. And as we kind of transition into opportunities for improvement, something that's both a strength and a weakness of Monster Hunter as a franchise, I think, is that there are no roles in the sense that you might expect in an MMO co-op game. There's not a tank, a healer, and a DPS. There aren't really predictable aggro mechanics, which is good in the sense that when you're playing this game co-op with other players, you're not really dependent on your fellow players to do anything other than to not die, right? As long as they're doing damage, everyone's a DPS and everyone's being productive. So if it's the kind of game where it stresses you out to have to fill a specific role, play as a specific kind of character, to not be able to join a map because you're not playing the right role, if that's a frustration for you, then Monster Hunter is a really good game. It's kind of nice that everyone's just sort of responsible for themselves, although bringing it to the opportunity section, I kind of am disappointed in the fact that there's fairly little interaction between the hunters. Because of the lack of roles and the lack of an actual support class, there is a horn that you can use that has some mild support abilities you can apply to other characters, and a few consumable items that affect other characters. Generally, you're not really working together with the other players that much. You can mount monsters, which after successfully mounting a creature, it's disabled temporarily, so you can try to work together to mount and take down a creature so that people can get in a big burst of damage. That can be nice. I guess if you're chatting over voice chat or something like that, you can give each other tips about when you should be dodging if one player notices a tell and another one doesn't. But there's fairly little player-to-player interaction. It's almost like you're each playing a single-player game against this monster that just happens to share a health pool across the 4 of you. The argument for the exclusion of tank and healer roles in this game is that since it's so farming focused, it's about fighting the same monster over and over and killing it as quickly as possible in order to get its drops. Even if you added, optional tank and healer roles, everyone would just play as a DPS anyway, because 4 DPS that are taking care of themselves are always going to do more damage and end the monster fight more quickly than having a tank or a healer that has their attention split in other directions. So I totally hear that. It would be cool if, like they have done with the Palico and Monster Hunter Generations, if in a future game they added more traditional aggro mechanics. There is a mild aggro mechanic in Monster Hunter, but it's very difficult to predict. If you've ever played Guild Wars 2 before, at least Guild Wars 2 before the first expansion, they had this same idea. Like, let's do MMO combat, but let's get rid of the Holy Trinity because of all of the toxicity that comes with it. And it didn't really work when Guild Wars 2 first came out, and I think it was because it didn't have some sort of predictable aggro mechanic. It's so important for these fights to work and for people to work as a team to know how the monster is going to behave, who it's going to attack, and so on. So I think taking the existing aggro mechanics and making them more clear, giving you the ability to control aggro in some way, to drop it or to claim it, even if that's something that every single character has access to, I think that would be really powerful for the multiplayer experience, to be able to provoke the boss, even if you don't have to play a specific class, use a specific weapon to do that. If everyone has the ability to do it, I think that would be really cool. And I think that the key there is keeping that as an option. It's something that players can choose to do. I mean, playing with all DPS characters is still going to be the ideal way to play. But it takes so long to get to the stage where you're having to play ideally that I think that opening that door for newer players is going to be pretty important. It's probably easier to heal when you don't really understand how the monsters work just yet. So you can at least know you're being somewhat productive in helping your other players if you're playing as a healer, and then maybe later on you go, okay, we don't need to heal anymore, everyone can take care of themselves. I'm going to try playing one of the more challenging DPS classes. And on the subject of changing your playstyle in the end game, I think that's a really major opportunity for improvement as far as I'm concerned with Monster Hunter. Coming into the series so late in the franchise, it really feels like each game is designed with the assumption that you've played every Monster Hunter game and you know how it works. It would be irritating for a veteran player to have to go through a lot of tutorial and a lot of slow gating and conveyance to get used to it because, like I said, you probably should only be playing the most recent game in the series anyway. But it makes it really hard, I think, to get into the franchise if you haven't played it before. There's a lot of obtuse mechanics that are kind of difficult to wrap your head around when the game doesn't really focus on them in some way. Maybe a solution to that is for when you boot up the game to say, is this your first Monster Hunter game, yes or no? If you say no, it plays the way it does right now and leaves out a lot of the gating and tutorials. And if you say yes, it does a little bit of a better job of introducing you to it. Related as well to the end game being different, I think that as with a lot of Japanese games that have this sort of multiplayer format, the end game is significantly better than the beginning of the game. It's almost too forgiving at the beginning. It's not really a good picture of what Monster Hunter is going to be like later. And I think that this is the sort of game that, like Dark Souls, benefits from being hard right out of the gate, because that's what makes it interesting. Like, this game is fun when if you mash buttons, you're going to die. If you don't dodge an attack, you're going to die. And the early game kind of trains you the wrong way because it gives you so much room for error that you're not going to have in the late game. And that's when you're actually going to be having fun with it. So I would think about making the early game much harder, not having such a slow spin up. Because early on, you're doing missions that are just you gathering things, that are just you fighting weak, non-giant monster enemies to farm for items. And in the late game, those completely go away. There are no gathering missions. There are no fight weak monsters missions. They're all giant monsters, which is what the game is all about. I think that they should just speed up and get you there right at the beginning and kind of show you what this is supposed to be about from the get-go.
So into my final thoughts, I really liked Monster Hunter. I had a lot of fun playing it. I think that it's best to be played multiplayer if you're able to pull that off, and games like Monster Hunter Generations make that a lot simpler by offering a parallel progression track from the single-player mode. I believe it was Monster Hunter 4U where you needed to do some of the single-player in order to unlock things for the multiplayer, and it just didn't feel quite as fun to go through and do the single-player missions, at least for me as a streamer. But I do think it's a really good game. I think that you should absolutely play it if I said you were listed in any of those audience segments. Especially if you're into a challenge and you like co-op gaming. I'm hopeful for the future in Monster Hunter. I'm hoping that as each game comes out, it adds more and more quality of life features and tries to really define itself and say, is this a game about, long boss fights that you play with other people, or is this a game about survival? I'm not sure that it can actually be both, because it seems like focusing on one is kind of to the detriment of the other. So I'd be really interested to see how the series evolves over the next 10 years or so, because it looks like it's such a mainstay franchise in Japan and starting to be in the West as well, that we're going to be seeing Monster Hunter games for a really long time. So yeah, I think that final thoughts are play Monster Hunter and let's see how much better it gets in the next 5 or 10 years. Thanks, everybody.